Welcome to all of you to our online panel discussion. My name is Johannes van der Ven, and I'm the Managing Director of Good Energies Foundation based in Zug, here out of Switzerland. And it's a privilege to facilitate today's discussion with a very distinguished panel of experts. Over the last couple of months, the Responsible Mining Foundation has organized several interactive online panel discussions, and we had a discussion on the role of mining in advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. We had another one on the role of mining in the green energy transition, and one on embedding the gender perspective at the heart of responsible mining practices. And you can all watch these interesting discussions online on the YouTube page of the Responsible Mining Foundation. But today's discussion will focus on the role of mining in climate change. As we know, the way we manage or mismanage climate change will define the future of human civilization. And it's important to realize that this future is already today's reality for many communities where mining takes place, especially in developing countries. As we know, mining is often the very first link in global value change. You only have to look at the screen in front of you. The material you look at started somewhere in a mine, and even the wires transmitting the images and sounds right now also started somewhere in a mine, probably. And also in the context of climate change, mining and mined commodities take a very essential role. The production and transmission of energy depends on mining and therefore makes it crucial in the race to a net zero emission society. And as the mining industry is relatively CO2 intensive, it is also a very important stakeholder in the climate debate. So you might think that mining industry takes climate change very seriously, but unfortunately that's not necessarily the case. A recent report produced by the Responsible Mining Foundation reveals that a massive 63% of assessed large-scale mining companies have not identified and reported on the potential implications of climate change on communities, on workers, and on the environment. And none of these assessed large-scale companies could demonstrate having covered all of these three dimensions in their assessments. And that brings me to the key objectives that I would like to propose for today's panel discussion. First of all, it's important for all to get clarity on what is really at stake in the climate mitigation debate from a mining perspective. What deserves more attention and what is underreported? What should be done more? And as a second objective, how can we clean up or get a cleaner value chain in the mining industry? Or how should the mining industry better address climate issues in its business models? And what are the best practices that we all have to promote? And finally, a third objective, how can mining become compliant with the Paris Climate Agreement? What is the role of the mining industry to limit the temperature to not more than 1.5 degrees Celsius? In other words, what can mining do to reduce its carbon footprint and become more Paris compliant? And to shed some light on these urgent questions, I feel I'm in good company today as we have the presence of some key players and experts in this field. And as mining and climate are truly global issues, I'm happy the panel is also truly global in nature. And let me briefly introduce you to the speakers. First, we have Timer Manarung, and Timer is the director of Auriga Nusantara, and he's based out of Indonesia. Welcome, Timer. Then we have Carmen Hagenaars, the Deputy Director, Inclusive Green Growth at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands. Welcome, Carmen. And third, we have John Mulligan. John is the Director of Market Relations and the Green and the Climate Change Lead of the World Gold Council out of the United Kingdom. Welcome, John. And then we have Myrna Cunningham, who is the President of FILAC, the Development Fund for Indigenous Peoples in Latin America and the Caribbean. And you also used to be the chair of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues at the United Nations. and Mirna is joining us from Nicaragua. Welcome, Mirna. And I also would like to welcome John Houchin, who is the Secretary General of the Council on Ethics of the National Pension Funds in Sweden. Welcome, John. And last but not least, we have the privilege to have Estelle Levin-Nelly among us. And Estelle is the CEO and founder of Levin Sources and is now co-leading a project with the World Bank on forest smart mining. And Estelle is from Scotland. Welcome, Estelle. And before giving the floor to our panelists, I would like to ask the audience to start putting your questions or any remarks you want to make in the chat box, because this is not supposed to be a monologue or a presentation, but rather a lively discussion. And I think where we can share our concerns and learn from each other's. And we will be taking questions in written form throughout the entire event. And if you want to send a question, please use the Q&A function of Zoom. The button is located at the bottom of the application if you're using a computer, or on the upper right corner if you're using a smartphone. And as the first opening, I would like to give the floor to you, Hélène de Villiers-Piaget. Hélène is the CEO of the Responsible Mining Foundation. And Hélène, I already briefly referred to a new report that your organization published on the link of mining and climate. Can you please elaborate a little bit on the results of this latest report? Over to you, Hélène.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So the report that Johannes spoke about is the RMI Report 2020. It covers 38 large-scale mining companies who together represent about 28% of the value of production worldwide. And we look at a range of ESG issues. In amongst this, of course, is climate. And we see climate as a transversal issue that cuts across a whole range of other issues as well. So for this particular discussion, and because we have the privilege of such a rich panel with us, we're going to try and bring the discussion away from carbon, because we think carbon light is very much on the world's agenda. It's on the radar of governments, of investors, of financiers, of companies, of society in general, and everybody understands the importance of moving towards carbon light in one or other way. And we've just recently seen more and more governments actually declare how they want to go carbon neutral in the coming decades. But this also has meant that we've started using, and we can see this here, because we can see from the RMI report that companies are tracking and trying to adjust to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in Scope 1 and Scope 2. What you see on the screen here is on the horizontal axis, those green bars represent the company's performance. It's the 38 companies we look at, and the top score would be society expectations. So we see here that most companies are already showing evidence that they're paying attention to carbon emissions, and basically that it's on the agenda. But we'd like to move on from there in this discussion. We've come to use these words clean, green, and renewable very frequently and easily. And they bring a kind of comfort to everybody, because it's like opportunities are there, we've got solutions, and we can move ahead towards light carbon or carbon neutral future. But there's nothing clean or green, unfortunately, about a lot of the mining that happens that would support the infrastructure and the hardware that allows us to access what is called renewable energy. And so we need to think a little bit about all the other impacts as well that mining has. So changes in climate exacerbate other existing impacts. There are impacts already that come about because of mining's activities. And some of that is inevitable. Just by doing mining, there are inevitable ESG impacts, even if it's done in the most responsible way. There are also unintended consequences where planning hasn't taken everything into account. People haven't prepared for circumstances, and we have unintended negative consequences that also arrive from mining. And then lastly, the worst is where there's collateral damage because of careless mining and people not thinking ahead. So this brings us to the lens with which we view the impacts of mining. And mining, as we've said before on lots of our publications and on other events, mining is essential. There's no question that we can do without mining. We do have to have mining, and we definitely need mining to be able to ensure renewable energy. But then it's a question of how important responsible mining becomes. And if we look at climate, one can look at it through different lenses. Mostly, rating agencies, companies, banks, investors, look at it from a materiality lens. And that's understandable because this is about risk to business, and one needs to think about financial and reputational risks, also in the context of climate. The Responsible Mining Foundation, though, and through the RMI report, tries to look at it more broadly, beyond materiality as well, through a salience lens, which looks as well to risk to others. And usually this involves people and the environment. And what are the kinds of risks one thinks of in terms of climate? As we've said, climate can exacerbate the risks. And so it's things like water, for example. There's water stress in dry climates. There's water flooding where we have extreme incidents of rain arriving. There's heat as well, where for workers it becomes warmer, more difficult to work in very hot climates. And another example, which is very prominent in many discussions, is tailings facilities, where changes to climate can exacerbate the risks of tailings facility failures, which of course have enormous implications on others. So this slide speaks to what Johannes, I think, mentioned at the beginning, where one of the things we ask is whether companies in the process of looking at climate change for their business, and we see a lot of evidence of companies paying attention, doing risk assessment for their business, developing mitigation strategies in terms of climate, but very, very few can show that they've identified climate exacerbated impacts on others. And when we talk about others, it's communities usually, workers, the environment, and other industries that share the area where they're operating with them. So this is very discouraging to see how little salience is brought to looking at climate impact. And this is, of course, the area that we'd like to see improvement in. So if one talks about the interconnectedness, of course, between where operations take place and where mining is happening in the region where others are present, where there are communities, where there are other industries, where there's agriculture, and of course where workers have to exist and work, water comes to mind very easily. What you see here is the results when we combine quantity and quality management by mining companies. These are overall results. And as you can see, it's still a pretty low show for companies showing evidence that they're looking at quantity and quality management. And again, as we've said before, this really becomes more and more important where one's looking at the drier areas and areas that are becoming more dry and where we're likely to see even more mining occurring to supply all the mining product that one needs to access renewable energy. The last slide we'll show you, because we just want to bring a few illustrations from the report, is on financial assurance. So the report is based on where we can find public domain evidence. And this is for us one of the most shocking findings, because we see no public evidence whatsoever for any of these companies to show that they have financial assurance for disaster management and recovery. And if one just thinks of tailings again, it's really essential that companies are able to show that they have provided for disaster recovery and unanticipated events. We see today, again, in the Financial Times, in fact, there's an article which speaks to the claims by insurers or demands by insurers for a very big mining company to provide collateral for incidents like this and how much pressure that puts on the financial stability of the company. So, of course, these are very big issues that need to be seen from a wide lens. and one does need financially successful businesses. On the other hand, we need to also think about mining in the system of society at large. So this discussion is really, in a sense, to reinforce the fact that the opportunity is now. It's an opportunity now for companies to think about managing risk to the business, of course, and also mitigating risk at the same time for others, to think of it from a systemic perspective, from an interconnected perspective, and hopefully to avoid remedy discussions later, which brings us to the three words that everybody knows so well from the guiding principles on business and human rights of protect, respect, and remedy. We'd really prefer that we don't have to get to discussions around remedy if we take action now. I'm handing back to you, Johannes, and look forward to hearing what the rest of the panel has to say.
Thank you, Alain, for summarizing that compelling RMI report 2020, which you can all download on the website of the Responsible Mining Foundation. And now I would like to hand over to the panelists. Let's do a first round of interventions where I will ask the panelists to set the stage in maximum in 5 minutes. And if I may, Timer, let me start with you. You are working for Auriga, which is an Indonesian non-governmental organization that aims to conserve your country's very rich and abundant natural resources, right? And you are producing research and you're recommending policies to better manage natural resources. How is climate change affecting the relation with mining in Indonesia? Can you elaborate on these issues, please? The relationship between mining and climate change?
Yeah, thanks, Johannes. Good evening, all panelists and all participants. Yeah, as Indonesia is in archipelago countries, we have more than 13,000 islands. It's also in volcanic area, and we have abundant of mineral and coal, and including deep sea mining. We have the potential, and at the moment we worry more on small islands that we then part of our problem in climate change, and all and Indonesia habited in this in lowland. So then we, once climate change comes, and then the temperature is high, and then it is the people that will affect highly on because of the deep the sea level, and also the even at the moment our season is quite different. Farmer cannot predict the climate or the weather based on their wisdom, their traditional wisdom, because it changed already. Before we have only two season, rainy and dry, and at the moment is, but then the timing is not regular anymore. So it's actually and one particular commodity that also being highly linked with the climate is coal, as we have high potential of coal, but also we have the peatland that bring fire in Indonesia. So then we highly affected by this mining and also that consequence to the climate. So that's Johannes.
Thank you, Timer. So next, I would like to give the floor to you, Carmen Hagenaars in the Netherlands. Carmen, you're working at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Netherlands is playing a very important role in importing mine commodities as being at a very important international trading hub, right? So what is your ministry doing to minimize the impact of mining on climate, especially in developing countries? Can I ask you to elaborate on that, please?
Sure. Thank you, Johannes. And before trying to respond to that question, which is not very easy, let me say that I'm delighted to participate in this panel, and also let me express my thanks to the Responsible Mining Foundation for the initiative of this session. And it's great to see so many participants. It's really impressive how many participants we have now today. So yeah, what possibilities do we as the Netherlands government see to minimize the impacts of mining in developing countries that will be aggravated by climate change? We know, and Hélène also elaborated already on that the global demand for metals and minerals used in the energy transition is accelerating along with the transition itself. And take, for example, the example of cobalt used for batteries in electrical vehicles, which in the end we are now trying to move towards in 2030. But it means also the use of a lot of metals and minerals that are that we need for the energy transition and for other innovations. Although we are not ourselves, we don't hold these resources ourselves, nor does the European Union in a significant way. We are, of course, large consumers. And our mineral supply chains need to lead to countries like the DRC, like Niger, like China, Bolivia, Colombia. And these countries are growing in strategic importance. And what struck me indeed in the Responsible Mining Index report is the finding that improved performance on responsible mining is driven by external requirements set by, of course, the producing country, but also by investors and supply chain actors who may be acting on their home country rules and codes of conduct. So this, in fact, is an encouragement for us to continue furthering national and European policy in this area. And I see policy shifting and intensifying in several areas, such as voluntary and law-based approaches to transparency and responsible business conduct, and strategies from import-dependent countries to reduce supply risks whilst improving responsible sourcing. So the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we work hard with a wide range of stakeholders to be at the forefront of thinking and acting on responsible business conduct and improving responsible mineral supply chains. Over the last 5 years, we have been moving along the lines of voluntary measures. And let me mention 3 initiatives that we are supporting. First, corporate social responsibility covenants, we call them, in sectors such as gold, metals, but also in the pension fund sector. Secondly, funding for traceability and transparency initiatives, like the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, the EITI, that we also support. And thirdly, the promotion of the OECD guidelines and the adoption also of the OECD Women's Rights and Mining Statement. As recently as of last month, we have embraced the complementary role of legal obligations on due diligence to these voluntary measures. We will be looking into a mix of obligatory and voluntary measures. And we are also encouraging European initiatives in the area. And I'm excited about the entry into force of the EU's conflict mineral resolution that may prove a testing case for upcoming horizontal measures. I want to also highlight the importance of accompanying measures. 1, to support supply chain actors to meet their obligations on due diligence, and 2, importantly also to materially support improvements in producing countries. This duality is reflected in the European Partnership on Responsible Minerals, a multi-stakeholder initiative to support due diligence and projects that contribute to local development. And then another example worth mentioning is the Netherlands is pioneering with the World Bank in its climate smart mining facility to support countries. To conclude, we know that mining of minerals and metals is correlated with human rights violations and environmental degradation, and therefore there has always been a case to try to improve this. In the near future, risks are exaggerated by climate change itself and by projected future demand for metals and minerals for the energy transition. Increased competition for these resources should lead to increased support and better opportunities for sustainable development in producing areas. But with higher stakes come higher risks. We are therefore very concerned that we may see developments in the opposite direction. We are acting on this risk by, first of all, agenda setting. For example, by hosting the conferences early next year on climate adaptation, but also on the World Circular Economy Forum, which is focusing specifically on the link between circular economy and climate. Secondly, tangible local support, for instance, in the Great Lakes. Thirdly, supporting a coherent European approach to securing access to critical raw materials. And at last, improving international trade governance from our aid and trade integrated agenda. That's it for me, Johannes. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. So next, I would like to give the floor to you, John Mulligan of the World Gold Council out of the United Kingdom. John, the World Gold Council is a large industry association that aims to stimulate and sustain the demand for gold. May I ask you, how is the issue of climate mitigation shaping the agenda of the World Gold Council? Over to you, John.
Thanks. And hello, everybody, and thanks again to the Responsible Mining Foundation for this opportunity to speak. It's great to hear and see so many people on this call. So there are several issues because when you look at climate change and climate change risks, well, climate change, changes everything. And what I mean by that is one part of our focus is literally on risk and risk mitigation. Another, however, is on what we can do, if you like, to contribute to climate mitigation in terms of the pathway and the risk to net zero. So I know this is not a conversation about carbon footprinting. It's not a conversation really about emissions reduction, but I would like to say that we need to be somewhat realistic when we talk about these issues. The question is, what are the local impacts, I guess, of climate strategies? And yet really we're just embarking on this path. And from my experience, and it's not just the experience with gold mining companies and mining companies more generally, but if you look at other sectors, I think in terms of implementing plans on the ground to have climate conscious strategies, we're still fairly early stage. So I'm slightly challenging Helene's point of view that we can take this as assumed. But what I think for gold and gold mining, what we can do is look at what that opportunity looks like. What does the opportunity for mitigation and adaptation look like? And you can look across the whole risk spectrum. You can look at near-term transition risks, or you can look at longer-term physical risks and see, okay, well, what do the plans, when they start to be implemented, what do they look like for local communities, host countries, etc. Now, for me, I think, we could talk about this for a very long time because the risk spectrum is huge, but let's talk about near-term transition risks, because for me, there's an opportunity there. And I think, as I say, we're looking forward, we're talking about projected impacts. And for me, there's an opportunity in terms of gold mining, I would argue, is in a relatively positive place to contribute to decarbonisation. And that is to do with decarbonising energy and electricity. And when we start to look at what that means at the local level, this isn't just a case of shifting away from fossil fuels. This is a case of actually potentially contributing to SDG 7, to wider access to clean and affordable energy. And when we talk about that, and when we talk about what the current initial steps look like, we're talking about bringing communities that are either off-grid or wholly dependent on fossil fuels for any energy generation. We're talking about bringing electricity to those communities, electricity that is decoupled from emissions to some extent, or hopefully to a substantial amount, which allows them, if you like, to have the sustainable development impacts, the positive development impacts that we see with electricity consumption without the emissions profile. Now, if gold mining can catalyze, stimulate that, I think that is a very substantial positive impact. And it's not an impact purely about decarbonisation. When we're talking about clean electricity, we are, of course, talking about extending classroom times, of removing polluting fuels from the cooking process, of enabling people to preserve foodstuffs. We're talking about a whole load of development impacts that are far broader than just the decarbonisation story. So for me, the opportunity is there. we're seeing initial steps. We're seeing, you know, possibly the introduction of microgrids based on renewables, very much hybrid solutions, hybrid energy solutions, which allow both energy security, but also, as I say, a cleaner energy source. And I think when you start to consider that as the opportunity, the question is then, does the industry embrace the opportunity? And that's a key question, because, as I say, it's early stages. And so whenever we're looking at what the benefit, the net benefit might look like, we're looking at projections, because this is, you know, an early stage, the first steps in a path that we're all embarking on. As I say, I think gold mining is in a positive place to make a substantial contribution if it is supported by stakeholders to allow it to, as I say, decarbonize the supply chain, the electricity supply that may be available to communities on the ground. That to me is a kind of a very key, immediate, near-term opportunity.
Thank you, John, for this industry perspective. And next, I would like to give the floor to you, Mirna Cunningham, out of Nicaragua. Mirna, in your role as president of FILAC and in your work with the United Nations on indigenous issues, how do you see climate change is exacerbating the mining impacts on indigenous communities? We all know that the indigenous communities often live nearby sites where mining takes place. What are the key issues from the community perspective that deserve and require more attention, in your opinion?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for inviting us to be part of this panel. Of course, for indigenous people, this type of conversation is very important because mining has a great impact on the life of indigenous peoples in different parts of the world. When we discussed, recently I had a meeting with indigenous communities in 29 countries, and the two main concerns related with their livelihood is extractive industry and climate change. Those two are the main concerns. And the point of view of indigenous peoples is that our concept of development, our model of development, requires a direct relationship between indigenous peoples, other sectors of society, states, and of course, private companies. And this and mining is a very important, mining resources is very important in our communities, but we understand that it's not infinite, it's not renewable, so it should be used in a very responsible and limited way. The first concern is related with technology. Technology usually have played a very destructive role in environment and in our communities. Water pollution, the impact on people's health. Mining is still using a lot of contaminants in most of our communities. So this is an important aspect that we see as community. The second is related with the safeguards of our rights. Mining or minerals are usually on our territories, in our territories as indigenous peoples. We own more than 35% of land that is used for mining. So the concessions are given over our territories, and the legislation usually do not recognize our subsoil rights. So that we live on the territory and the subsoil is given in concession by the states without our free, prior, and informed consent, without our participation, and there's no benefits for indigenous peoples. And usually when there's a discussion on benefits, it's something very marginal, and it doesn't have anything to do with all of that we lose because of moving from the area of mining to another area. So I would say that the discussion on benefits and the impact, the socioeconomic impact of everything that is related with mining, the spiritual, the cultural, the impacts that are related with climate change impact on the communities. So I would say that for indigenous peoples, the aspect of property, land rights, and participation in decision making. The other aspect is related with the impact on labor force. Usually in the mining areas, indigenous peoples from different ages are the majority of the labor force. And that labor force point of view related with climate change is not considered in any one of the labor relation. And I would say that the fourth aspect is related with the international standards. We are talking about standards in this panel, but usually when mining companies come into our communities, they do not respect those international standards, and least the international standards related with the recognition of indigenous people's rights. So I would say that those are the elements that are at stake when we talk about indigenous peoples and climate change and mining industry.
Thank you, Mirna, for this perspective from the indigenous viewpoint. And next, I would like to move now to Sweden, to you, John Houchin. John, in your role on the Ethics Council of the Swedish pension funds, how have you been engaging with mining companies? And I'm actually especially thinking about the issue of tailings, or the byproducts of mining, right? That often include highly toxic and radioactive material. How is this issue perceived in the world of asset management, and how has been the reaction of the mining industry?
So thank you, Johannes, and thank you all for joining. I hope all of you are doing well in these very unprecedented times. I've just had COVID, so I'm a bit tired. If I look a bit tired, I am a bit tired, but I've done fine, so no need to worry. But it's very special times. So I'm one of the co-conveners for the Global Industry Standard on Tailings Management that was just released in August with UNEP, PRI. I was one of the PRI representatives, and ICMM, which is the Mining Council, International Council of Metals and Mining. My council has been engaging with the mining industry for about 15 years now, on globally all over the world on different mining issues. I was heavily involved post-Mariana, where the Samarco accident was. I was one of the few investors who actually came down to Mariana to check out the impact and the restoration being done by the Renova Foundation post-Mariana, and what BHP and Vale had done in terms of dam security post-Mariana. So obviously, on a personal level, I was hugely disappointed, and it was a terrible disaster when Brumadinho struck 2 years ago, and 270 people lost their lives. On a personal level, I was hugely involved in this quest that we've now done on tailings, which has been a quest for the whole mining whole investment industry and the mining industry. So we've been in contact with about 700 listed mining companies to get their disclosure on tailings dams. We've built a database with Grid Arendal in Norway. You can check that database. We have about 2,000 tailings dams now in that database. We have another 20,000 tailings dams being prepared to add to that tailings database that we're building. We need a bit more resources to get all of that into the system. But we're planning to build a very comprehensive and transparent database for all tailings dams in the world, available for everyone. All local communities and everyone that has any kind of impact or relevance to these tailings should be able to know what kind of risk they're at and where they're at. So we're building that. We've done the standard together with UNEP and with the ICMM. All the ICMM members have agreed to implement this global standard on tailings right now, and they're also doing guidelines so we can spread those guidelines to all other mining companies as well. And as I said, we have 700 listed mining companies online for those. I think what's important with those guidelines and to this issue today is that the tailings dams are obviously at risk when it comes to climate change impacts of flooding, for instance, liquefaction, which has been the issue with both Brumadinho and Mariana, is a risk for existing tailings dams, but also constructing and what kind of methods mining industries will use going forward on tailings is going to be important. But I think the key issue that we have in terms of tailings and mining and the green economy and the transition to a green economy is that we need to mine more with less waste. We need to develop better technologies. We need to mine a lot smarter if we're going to continue mining what we need. And I think that's a huge challenge, and that's a really important discussion that we need to focus on going forward. But there's been a number of good points being raised here. I'd like to put big shout out to Helene and Pierre and all the others at Responsible Mining Foundation. A brilliant report once again. And to Helene's point, I do think the insurance industry is picking up quickly, and the banking industry that is supplying financing to all these separate mine entities are picking up quickly. So it's all coming together. And we're planning for an independent entity together with the UN right now that's going to oversee the implementation of the tailings standard. We're going to see to that we get proper third-party independent verification. And with that, I mean proper independent verification on that standard. So I think there is some positive change coming out of these horrendous accidents that we've had. And I do think, even though there's a lot of expectations on mining right now, and rightly so, a number of the mining companies are giving a bit of pushback because they've been heavily impacted by COVID, and I'm quite mindful of that. And we do tend to ask them for a lot of data and a lot of information, and we need to understand there's some really good mining companies out there that are really trying to respond to all this. So there's a balance to be hit here, but I do think we're moving at least in the right direction, put it that way.
Thank you, John, for this perspective from a risk perspective and asset management perspective on mining. And now finally, you, Estelle. Estelle, you're currently working on an assignment with the World Bank, right, on forest smart mining. Mm-hmm. So from a climate mitigation and resilience perspective, what's mining got to do with forest? I know you recently published a report on forest smart mining strategic entry points for donors, right? Can you elaborate on that, please?
Sure, Johannes, and thank you to the Responsible Mining Foundation for inviting to participate here today. Yes, so the work with the World Bank has been going on for several years over several projects to first conceptualize and then figure out what does forest smart mining mean, and then what does it mean in practice on the ground. And we had the fortune to further develop that thinking this summer to provide some really strategic starting points for investors, donors, civil society, markets, host nations, and etc. So some of the points that have been raised already actually are picked up on a bit in the report, and it was launched today. So thank you for mentioning that. But I think in the context of this project, why do forests matter, and why are we even bringing them into this conversation? About 30% of the world of terrestrial land is covered with forest, and that has been decreasing. There's a net forest loss every single year, and forests really matter for humanity and for today and tomorrow, not just from the point of view of climate change, but if we can involve forests as part of our climate change solutions in mining, we can get the additional benefits of also protecting biodiversity, securing ecosystem services for local and global populations, and also protecting human rights, picking up on what Mirna was talking about as well. There is a lot of mining that's going on in forests, and mining has a big impact upon forests, and some of those impacts are very severe. So forests are affected in the following ways. Mining is the 4th largest driver of deforestation, and 7% of all deforestation in tropical and subtropical landscapes is caused by mining. About 10% of forests are impacted or influenced, let's say, by operational mines. But if you include as well mines that are under development and mines that have closed, it's 30% of forests. Now, if you think about the statistic I gave earlier, if we continue to lose forest cover, the forecasts are for mining's presence in forests, to grow regardless of that. We're going to see that forests are even more relevant to miners. So the nature of the impacts that mining has is not just to do with deforestation, it's also to do with degradation and the way that mining impacts on the sustainable management of land, sustainable land use. And also the fact that so much of mining requires restoration afterwards, or in some cases leads to no restoration at all, except what nature can do itself, which isn't always possible in all landscapes, doesn't always restore to the biological or carbon values that it had previously. And the nature of those impacts can be direct. So, for example, a mine produces a lot of waste that it needs to do something with, like tailings. And where tailings management, thank you, John, for progress there, that's a huge step forward in helping minimize mining's impacts on forests. They have indirect impact. So when you develop a mine, the infrastructure necessary to move minerals from the mine to the market, whether it's railroads or roads, is massively impactful on forests, not just for the sake of the trees cut down to build the road, but because it allows penetration of the forests by others for other economic actors. And then, of course, cumulative impacts are the hardest to deal with, which is where you're not just a mine in a landscape by yourself. There's probably other mines there, other industry, agriculture, hunting, whatever. There is a cumulative impact of all actors on forests. And if there's not coordination to manage that, we have a real issue. So how do you determine the nature of mining's impacts? There's three major things to think about. Where does it happen? How is it happening? And how well is it governed? And the Responsible Mining Foundation's report is a really useful insight into how well it's governed. Because if mining companies don't put in place the right management systems to understand the nature of their impacts, how can they possibly manage them? If you're operating in a country where the quality of governance is weak, then how are we going to ensure that this is done well? So there are lots of things to think about. Open cast mines are much more impactful than alluvial mines, for example. Which part of the mining life cycle are we talking about here? There's impacts on every stage. Is it impacts more scales? I mean, the artisanal miner, forgive me, who defecates in the forest where there's primates, can have a very serious impact on primate health. And this is a serious case that was raised with me 15 years ago in Congo, in the Kahuzi-Biega National Park, when I was working on gorilla conservation. One of the biggest concerns at the time for the local Mbuti, indigenous peoples group that was trying to manage conservation, was around how do we deal with concentrated defecation where there's primates living around. So from the smallest artisanal miner, there's impacts all the way through to the largest mines. However, the largest mines can be quite good at managing their impacts because they tend to have really good accountability frameworks. They're listed on stock exchanges. They're members of industry bodies like ICMM. It's that middle ground between small scale to medium scale where we really start to get problems, because you get a lot of mechanization, but not good capitalization or professionalization to be able to manage the impacts, or to be motivated to do it because you don't have the right accountability frameworks. So we really have to understand scale. And there's a really strong business case for action in specific countries and for specific minerals. Those minerals, if I can remember them, just reminding myself, are gold, zinc, aluminium, iron, nickel, and one that I'm forgetting that's important. And titanium is also important as well. But for those particular mineral categories, there's a really strong business case for them to be thinking about their impact on forests. And for certain minerals, for iron, for example, and titanium, about 50% of their mines are in forest landscapes. So they're really forest exposed already. And there's hotspot countries. I know Brazil is close to your heart, Johannes. That's the #1 country where we need to be worrying about this and thinking about what to do. Also the Congo, Zambia, Philippines, Indonesia. There's a list of hotspot countries we can focus attention on. But there's really, I think the good news is let's focus on the positives. I've always been impressed with miners' ingenuity and the multidisciplinarity of how they go about their business. And there is such possibility for mining companies to do more, whether it's to do with decarbonisation, like John mentioned, and the introduction of circular processes in mining, whether it's to do with innovations in exploiting legacy waste dumps, community development funds, how they can be leveraged for nature-based solutions, the empowerment of indigenous peoples. There's so much that miners can do, so we must focus on the positives, but let's not forget that forests are part of the solution and we can't just focus on technology.
Thank you. Thank you, Estelle, and all the panelists for these opening remarks. A lot of food for thought and very compelling insights I've been hearing. So now I would like to open the discussion and include the audience more in our conversation. And I see a lot of questions have already been raised in the Q&A function on Zoom, and I will do my best to recap them and to raise as much as possible. I see that a first bucket of questions have appeared around the role of communities. And Mirna, if I may, that brings me back to your contribution. You already told us that the indigenous communities have big concerns in how to deal with the contaminants, right? Water pollution, land degradation. And you also said that the indigenous peoples, they actually own 35% of the land where mining takes place, but they hardly take advantage of the benefits. And that's actually a mind-boggling statistic. 35% is owned by indigenous people and they hardly take any benefits, right? But at the same time, we all know that we have this declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples that's requiring states and companies to consult and cooperate in good faith with communities, right? And you already referred to the importance of obtaining free, prior, and informed consent. But how does this work in practice, right? What has been your experience in this field?
Our experience as indigenous peoples has been terrible. I would say that there's no, I don't find any country in which you can fully say they respect free, prior, and informed consent. And this is based on the fact that the international human rights standards recognizes the land rights of indigenous peoples, and they call to establish mechanisms, systematic mechanisms that ensure participation in decision-making of indigenous peoples. In the cases where this do not exist, that is in the majority of the countries worldwide, you require their authorization, and that is a process of consultation where indigenous peoples should be able to consent before exploration and before any type of investment on mining in their territories. This requires that the state create the conditions for this process of free, prior, and informed consent. This is a responsibility of the state, and the mining companies should be able to go through a process of due diligence where they should not go into any indigenous territories if this process is not respected. So I think that is the main concern. Now, one of the aspects of free, prior, and informed consent is the discussion on benefits. Benefits sharing should be one of the important aspects that should come out of this process of consent from indigenous peoples. So I would say that this is the step that we have to include in any type of standards that are established at the international level related with mining and indigenous communities in different parts of the world. And this is something completely recognized already in international standards of human rights. So there's no way to go back into that standard. We just have to find a way on how to put it into practice. If we really want to build a different type of relation that can reduce conflict in the areas of mining.
Thank you, Mirna. Very interesting remarks. And I see another bucket of questions arising on illegality, very much linked to this first issue. The mining is often linked to illegal conduct in various ways. For example, human rights violations such as child labor, discrimination, and sexual violence. Another bucket is around more environmental crimes, right, ranging from deforestation, pollution of water, pollution by mercury, biodiversity loss, you name it. A third bucket would be around land grabbing, conflicts over land issues. And last but not least, more responsible conduct, right? Money laundering and more white collar crimes. So this might be a question, if I may, Carmen, to you, on illegality. I think, Carmen, you already elaborated on this in your presentation on the importance of having due diligence laws, right? Because I see, for example, more and more among consumers here in Europe, that consumers, they don't want to eat Amazonian deforestation on their plate. They don't want to wear blood diamonds, right, on their pulses. How do you think, what's the role of the consumer in this, and how can governments advance this?
Yes, thanks, Johannes. Yeah, I think it's also what Mirna just said. I mean, there is international standards. It's a matter also of putting them good into practice. And I see for the link illegality, the link with consumers. I think there's several aspects to that. Transparency and traceability is an important one. It is important to get a better view on how transparent the chain is, in fact, and to what order you can trace where it comes from, the product that is being mined. Secondly, there's of course a responsibility with the companies on that that are involved in this chain. Thirdly, the consumers, they play a role themselves by being, I think there it starts by being well informed. If you know that your product comes from a conflict area, then you can act on that. Then you can basically, you know the consequences of your purchase, and you can act upon that. And then there's also, of course, the responsibility of governments from our side. And I think we try to do that. For example, that I would like to mention is in EU trade policy. There is, of course, they include binding commitments to the Paris Agreement and implementation of that. EU regulation and standards is an example. And I see indeed both due diligence and certification as possible steps.
Thank you, Carmen. Perhaps another panelist wants to react to this on the question of illegality before we move to the next block of questions. I don't know, perhaps John Houchen, you already mentioned the fiduciary duty of investors, right? For your responsibility to avoid illegality in portfolios. Is this something that's increasingly coming up in your work with the principles of responsible investing? There are more and more headlines around this. ESG investing is sharply on the rise. Is this a demand from investors, you see?
I think we're moving into a super transparent world. I think people need to be mindful that we're mapping the whole world as we speak. And it's becoming harder and harder to hide away. So, I mean, in many ways, I'm co-aligned with the Responsible Mining Foundation that there's much more focus on the individual mining sites globally all over the place. I mean, if we put this database in place, you will have all the mining sites in the world into one major database, and you will go from there. I think the driver now is transparency. I mean, we're using satellites, we're using blockchains. We're building we're trying to establish a super transparent and stable world, which will make it difficult with corruption and to hide away what we've been doing previously. I think that's my ambition. That's our ambition from the responsible investment community. It's going to take a while, but I can see all of these parts fitting together as we speak. And in the end, it's only transparency that's going to drive trust. And once you gain trust, you've got to keep trust. You've got to keep that trust because you can destroy it so easily. So that's what we and a lot of other investors are spending time on right now. And I think we see a lot of good things coming out of that.
Johannes, can I add a bit?
Sure, Timo. Absolutely.
Yeah, illegality means then it comes to law enforcement. And it means that we expect government to do their duty, for example. But then in this business, I think as Indonesia experience, as most of our product actually going to export, not processed in our country, means then there is another business out there that in reciprocal and it's in let's as we do kind of beneficial ownership mapping, we sometimes come to layer of or companies, the producer, smelting, trading, buyers. It's totally different company, and not only in one jurisdiction. It's inter-jurisdiction in so many cases involving tax haven countries. I think also not only in, yes, we have a kind of problem as corruption we have, and we have that kind of governance problem, but also we need collaboration between countries, between jurisdiction to open up who actually are the beneficial owners, how then this supply chain. And is, as we discuss transparency, I think of this extractive sector, I think in my eyes is the mining is the newcomers of transparency compared to timber, compared to palm oil. It's discussing who actually the beneficial owner of big minings. I think it's rare here. So I think we need to learn from other commodities to bring transparency, supply chains, and then come then law enforcement.
Thank you, Timur. And I have a next question for John Mulligan, if I may, John. For many people here in the audience, I'm reading that it's not clear how gold mining is helping the energy transition, right?
Sure.
As gold is obviously mainly used for jewelry and for central banks, right? Are gold companies considering degrowth or reducing their activity to promote a more circular economy and also to avoid the more energy-intense mineral extraction? And the second question related to this is more on the how to open up the role to all stakeholders in promoting more recycling, reuse, and reduction to consumption to better address climate change.
Sure. So I think I'll answer the recycling question first, the circular economy, because people often may not realize that 1/3, 25% or 30% of annual gold supply is recycled gold. And that means, of course, that the demand for gold exceeds the supply. So recycling fills in that gap. But gold is probably one of the most recyclable products ever known to man. It is largely indestructible. So all gold that's mined, unlike pretty much any other metal or commodity, is not destroyed and therefore is potentially recyclable, and is recyclable, as I say, on a very substantial basis. That said, demand outstrips supply. So the demand comes from somewhere, and then the question therefore is, how is that demand satisfied? And that brings us to a lot of the questions I think that we've talked about today. I would argue are the broad questions on responsible sourcing, and that affects all sectors, or certainly all materials and all supply chains. I would argue that the gold supply chain over the last decade or so has certainly become more conscious of these challenges, and I can't talk about the artisanal side because, one, it's, as we all know, it's opaque, very challenging. I think there are big questions about how we address the artisanal sector going forward, how we seek to support its potential formalization, etc. But I think when we talk about responsible sourcing, then the issues regarding conflict, the issues regarding, frankly, all of the ESG spectrum of risks, the gold supply chain has become aware of them, starting with conflict and the conflict-free minerals and the OECD guidance and so on. So the World Gold Council launched quite some years ago now the conflict-free gold standard to allow responsible miners to potentially participate in high-risk and conflict-affected areas, because we thought there was beneficial impacts potentially, rather than leave a vacuum. So starting from conflict and moving forward in terms of, as I say, addressing the whole risk spectrum of what responsible sourcing means for all gold stakeholders, I think the industry has come a long way. I think there's a lot cleaner or tighter supply chain in terms of chains of custody of responsibly sourced product. And from our point of view, in terms of, well, what does responsible gold mining mean in practice? We launched the Responsible Gold Mining Principles last year to attempt to operationalize those high standards of ESG. And the importance there is that, once they've become implemented and accepted, at least 50 or more % of formalized gold production can be demonstrated to have performed against 51 separate ESG standards, many of which will require the gold miner to bring in independent assurers. So you start to completely move to transparency, has been mentioned, a more transparent, more data-led, demonstrable approach to ESG performance from the gold mining sector. And I think a lot of this conversation has really been around that as much as it has been around climate. As I say, I'm fully aware that climate affects everything. But I think, so we can say that there is progress. There's clearly challenges, but I think the questions regarding, responsible sourcing and how the gold supply chain has moved and evolved, I think there is some cause for positivity, acknowledging the challenges. A very quick question, a very quick answer to the first question: how is gold contributing to the energy transition? You are right, gold, or certainly gold in volume, does not contribute particularly to renewable technologies. Gold is key in some very advanced technologies that may help us in the future. Gold powers nanotechnology, for instance, which may have some benefits. But what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the energy transition in practice and in terms of local communities is gold mining emissions all come pretty much from its energy use, or certainly the bulk of the whole emissions in the gold supply chain. To address that, to embrace transition, the gold mining industry needs to move to renewables quite quickly. And where it moves to renewables in areas where there is not clean energy, in fact, where there may be no reliable energy source, that will have beneficial impacts potentially far broader than just at the mine site. So that's what I meant by the transition impacts.
Great, John. Thank you. Carmen, do you still want to make a comment on the recycling and reduction of consumption? Or do you think it has been addressed sufficiently?
Yeah, I think, well, it's one of the topics, at least from our side, from Netherlands government, we are working on quite strongly. We have, the government defined 5 transition agendas on circularity, and I think there's still a long way to go, but it's at least something that we try to put in place now. On the other hand, I mean, only with reuse, we will probably also not, it won't be sufficient. I mean, the extra use of minerals will be so large that in the end, only reusing is not sufficient either. So I think there should also be work on consumers and on influencing indeed people to use less, in fact, and to do it better in that sense.
Thank you, Carmen. And I see a next question coming up from Ben and Catherine, which I would like to highlight. That's, I think, a question for you, Timer, in Indonesia. And that's on the issue of deep sea mining, right? Whether deep sea mining is becoming a major issue. And I think it can sound contradictory, right, with ESG standards and sustainable development goals, right, to start on deep sea mining. Are you concerned that deep sea mining could have devastating effects on Indonesia and other big island nations? And should we call for a ban or moratorium of this kind of mining? How is Auriga dealing with these issues?
Well, Auriga not work directly on that issue actually, but then as Indonesia, almost 2/3 of our area is sea, is ocean, and it seems that the future mining in Indonesia, or probably deep sea mining, probably if we allow. And now, as we see for tin mining, for example, in southern Sumatra, and it's already bringing conflict with fishermen, local fishermen there, because they lost their fishery area, and in eastern Indonesia, it's coming already, and the government seems to welcome openly with this, without without setting the standard as a start, so then inviting problem at the same time. Then in future we deal with that problem. Well, that's I think that the style of this current government here. But then I think it's the future. It probably come with devastating problem including also for climate change, not only on local. But again, our problem not only in deep sea mining, and on deep sea mining, I think at the moment, as now we are dealing in mining mostly with China, I think also both investment and also buyers, direct buyers, and environmental standard, I think not so highly respectable yet in China and Middle East. I think also we have regional discussion need to be leveraged. So then this kind of possible future should be tackled since the beginning.
Thank you, Timer. Yes, John Houchin, you want to react to? Go ahead.
Well, we've been looking into deep sea mining for a while now. It's obviously coming on the table, and I also think with all the work on tailings and actually showcasing that we can't build these tailings dams and we need to mine in a different way. It puts some versions. I think we need to be mindful there are different ways of doing deep sea mining. But we've been looking at the noodle extraction on the seabed floor. And I'm quite neutral. I think we need to explore it a bit further, but I think it's going to come whether we want it or not. And I think the whole discussion regarding the future of mining, we need to be a bit open-minded. There's not going to be a perfect solution, and it's going to be here. That's for sure.
Hélène?
Hi, thanks, Johannes, and also to Timer and John. I just want to say from Responsible Mining Foundation, we think it's really important to that a lot of care is taken, that we fully understand the impacts of deep sea mining. There seems to be a greater rush to start using it as a solution. We're also disappointed to see that the tailings standard doesn't address that, as we would have liked to have seen, because we think there should be a moratorium on deep sea mining until the world knows what it's doing. If you think about terrestrial mining, we're still trying to do responsible mining. We haven't arrived there terrestrially, where we can see what we're doing. So we think it's really important that deep sea mining is handled with great care before one goes ahead. Thanks, Johannes.
Thank you, Hélène. And then the next bucket of questions I see here might be something for you, Estelle, to reflect on. And that's more on how can mining be part of the solution, right? What are the, let's say, the preconditions of sustainable mining? So the one specific question I'm reading here is on the on when a new mine is being built, right? When an operations start. So what are then the most important actions to take into account to minimize the impact on landscapes, or more specifically on forests, right?
Sure.
Can you reflect on that?
On my answer first, which is that I'm a specialist more in artisanal and small-scale mining, and I rely on our strategic partners for Forest Smart Mining at Fauna and Flora International to really cover the large-scale mining stuff. But over now being in my middle age, I have managed to learn from my colleagues, I think, over time, so hopefully I can answer you. I think the infrastructure side of a mine's development is really, really important, as I mentioned before. And so, and exactly where you place the mine. So when I've been involved in environmental and social impact assessments, sorry, the sun is shining on me very brightly. In the past, there's been obviously one of the key things that's under discussion with the mine designers, I suppose, at that stage is exactly the placement of the processing and the warehousing and the tailing relative to the actual extraction site, and then the means of transportation. So, for example, in the work that Fauna and Flora International did for the World Bank as part of our collective study that we published last year, they found that Vale, for example, at one of its mines in Brazil, had really cutting edge means of operating in a highly sensitive forest landscape, because it had developed ways of moving the mineral through the forest in ways that absolutely minimized impact and really avoided the opening up of forest to other economic activities, which is one of the major issues. And I think a key point here is that what circularity teaches us is it's all about the design and getting it right up front. It applies also to our work in artisanal mining. We're often brought in at the point where a mining company has conflict and people have died and people, and it's a mess. And it's because they didn't figure out that you've got to engage well from the start. You've got to design your management systems well from the start. So I think your question that points out what we could do at that stage is critical. That is indeed the critical moment for minimizing impacts on forests, is how you design it and where you do it. But even I go back even a step further and say, could we at a central level, at a collective level, say for gold, we can say at the end of the year where demand, where supply came from to satisfy that demand, in what proportions. What proportion was recycled, so urban mining? What proportion came from legacy tailings? What proportion came from large-scale, medium, small-scale mines? We can break it down. Maybe we should be setting targets for what the proportion of land uses are in production, and be seeking very intentionally to be pushing greater circularity, so more recycle. But really, I really want to see the development of tailings as production areas. So where places that were mined for gold in the past can now be, those tailings heaps can be remined for rare earths or whatever other materials were in there. That kimberlite can be reused for carbon sequestration, for example. I think that's where there's a really exciting opportunity to reduce the impact of greenfield sites, because we're making better use of our brownfield sites.
Thank you, Estelle. John, you also want to react on this with your perspective on mining, with mining companies?
So there's several points, and I agree with a lot of what Estelle said. I think there's several points that when some downstream participants start to talk about circularity and impacts, net positive impacts, one of the things that is often forgotten on the equation is what possible socio-economic benefits responsible mining can bring. And it's a challenge because there are, as this conversation has clearly shown, there are many challenges to implementing responsible gold mining and maintaining it over time. And there are a whole load of legacy issues that we're still discussing. That said, I think John mentioned that mining is evolving with the future of technology, the changing shape of mining. And the question is, do we want an industry to be able to bring its positive impacts if it is managed responsibly? And this is, a big question. Do we want to? Because if you take it away, you look at some of the major developing economies of Africa, for instance, just as an example, and they are very much dependent on gold as a core driver of economic development. So the question is, what virtuous circle can be created to allow development to prosper? And I think that is the nature of what the whole conversation on responsible mining is. But I would say the idea that you can limit mining operations, and that is undoubtedly a positive, it should be challenged in some cases and in some countries, because I think there is, very significant benefits that responsible mining can bring. So I think it's just worth bearing in mind when we talk about the mining versus circularity, that the two, and the gold supply chain is a good example of that, and I appreciate Estelle's comments about working out what a balanced market looks like. But I think that we need to keep an eye on positive outcomes and not just kind of have a overly simplistic view of what supply looks like and what the impacts are.
Can I respond to that, Johannes, please?
Sure, quickly. We're almost running out of time.
I
Go ahead.
completely agree, and I want to back up John on it, because actually, if you look at the moratorium Kabila put on tin and tantalum tungsten mining in Eastern DRC about 10 years ago, which was all artisanal and small scale, what it did was it led to people turning to other natural resource-based livelihoods like charcoal making and hunting. So it had a devastating impact on forests in different ways. So yes, he's absolutely right. We had to take a nuanced approach, and there is definitely scope, and there must be responsible mining as part of our metals mix going forward because of the socioeconomic benefits they bring. I agree.
Thank you, Estelle. And unfortunately, we are coming almost to an end, although we have many more questions here. But I would still like to make a final round with all the panelists for you to make some closing remarks, right? And for this final minute, I'm going to give to each of you. I would like to ask you a question, right, to reflect a little bit on this. And that's on what do you think is the most important lever for changing the mining industry in addressing climate change, right? I think we've heard a very good mix of carrots and sticks that can be used, right? We need the importance of voluntary commitments in the industry and more regulatory requirements, right? But if we want to live in a Paris compliant world, we all have to do more, right? And what is the role of the mining sector to do more, to live in a 1.5 degrees world, right? May I perhaps start with you, Timer? We also started with you for this final round.
Yeah, thanks, Johannes. I think since let me then divide to problem and to solution. Actually, governance, improving governance in government, but also both in consumer. So educating or pushing consumer to do more. I think it's more that the probability of success is more on consumer rather than in government, because government it's already have a traditional way in dealing, and some come with politics sometimes. But in pushing, for example, Indonesia at the moment we have 11 million hectares of almost 3 times Netherlands of mining permit area, but we only dig that already 3%, 97% more. It's possible to dig more, and there is more than 3 million hectares, 30% of that still in forest cover. So we need to push actually to avoid this deforestation, to avoid mining in opening up the land, but then more focusing, and I think is the chance to do that more on industry and consumer. So then we need to have a way for consumer, when they buy a kind of product from mining, they know exactly how to differ their product, or the things that they buy come from responsible sourcing rather than mixing in the middle of the supply chain with let's say dirty products.
Thank you, Timer. Carmen, may I ask you to go next?
Yeah, sure. No, I fully agree with Timer. I think it's both governments and consumers, and I think the work the Responsible Mining Foundation is doing in that respect is so relevant, because we can use it as we do now. We use it as a way to dialogue on data that is being produced or that's being shown, and it's really helpful also to give us more insights into it. So no, I think it's magnificent to have this dialogue here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. John Mulligan.
So for me, key is clarity, consensus, probably preceded by collaboration on what climate conscious mining means. And so I think there's an assumption that the targets, that the outcomes are all agreed. I think, from my experience talking to miners, including gold miners, there's a huge information gap or an expectation gap between what actions are needed and what's being asked of them. So I think first of all, we need consensus. I think we need prioritization. So Helen mentioned action now. Well, what actions are required now and what actions are being asked of miners? And I think that needs to be said quite clearly. I mean, I think in the investment space and the reporting space, that's sort of consolidating and converging. But I think we need to really discuss, but also agree what those actions look like and what we're expecting. Because I think trying to solve all problems when there are some very pressing problems, we need a set of priorities. And I think that clarity, that if we can all agree what the positive outcome looks like for a climate strategy for a miner, then I think that will allow them perhaps to move forward. At the moment, I can assure you that there is quite a significant gap between what is being asked from stakeholders and investors and what miners think they're being asked. So I think convergence, collaboration, clarity.
Very clear, John. Thank you very much. John Houchin, you want to go next?
Yeah, I'm very much with the Timer. I think with the total transparency drive that's on now, and I think we need, what the markets really want is a better valuation, what is good miners, so the good miners get an extra pay for the good work that they're doing. You need the markets to play. Right now we're putting it all into the same bucket and it doesn't really work. So we need a clear picture of the dirty miners and the good miners. And I think the investors are actually pushing that, because we want to invest in the good miners, because we need good miners and we need clean and responsible miners. So I think transparency, to Timer's point and to Carmen's point, I think in the consumers, and we get the blockchains and we get the information on total transparency, and with the help of Helen and the other, the Responsible Mining Foundation, I think we're in a good spot. Let's keep on working on that.
Thank you, John. Estelle, what are your final words on this?
I always find it hard to choose, Johannes. I think there's so many levers, and I think colleagues here have raised really important ones. I mean, the two that came to mind for me immediately, if I go with those, were investors and indigenous peoples. Miners really listen to where the money's coming from, and governments need to listen to what indigenous people are saying and empower them to have a greater stake, like a real, not an emblematic stake, but a real stake in the benefits that can come from this sector. And when that happens, I think we'll see governance improve, and it really, at the end of the day, is about good governance.
Thank you, Estelle. And before handing it over to you, Helen, to wrap it up and perhaps elaborate on next steps, I would like to thank the hosts here, the Responsible Mining Foundation. I think the very fact that you're bringing all these stakeholders from different walks of life, different continents, to the table for a dialogue is very much needed, very much wanted. And therefore, I think this online discussion, this is not the end, but rather the beginning, right? The beginning of a much broader debate. So thank you very much for involving all of us in this. Your convening power has been great, and let me hand it over to you for the final remarks, Helen.
Thank you, Johannes, and also, of course, to all of our fellow panelists. It's just really wonderful to bring to the fore again. For me, the lever would be interdependence, because even if you think about supply chains, it's a whole interdependent story. The same goes with investors, mining companies themselves, indigenous peoples. You have to give their free, prior, and informed consent, and we put the emphasis on consent. And then, of course, consumers as well that need to learn and have the transparency to know where things are coming from. So the piece we'd like to end on is the importance of independence, that we continue working and talking interdependently with one another. And that means, of course, that we have to think about what we do in the context of others and not just ourselves. That goes for everyone and all the different players. And lastly, I want to end where John was mentioning convergence and clarity. I think this is really important, that we are clear on what is expected. We try and do that through the RMI report, but more can be made clear in terms of how climate affects others as well. Voilà, I'd like to leave it there. And the last thing I think is to go back to what John Houchen said and bring that back to Estelle in terms of the importance of local asset level information and dealing with these challenges at the asset level, at the mine site level. An investor once said to me, climate is local, finished. There's no other way to discuss it. So I think it's really important that we bring all these discussions back to the local level where people and environments are affected, and also where companies can actually do something about it, rather than just at the sort of multilateral level discussion. Thanks, everyone. We look forward to speaking to you again and convening more discussions.